Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the dust and sunlight of the ancient arena. So, dim the lights, set your phone down somewhere soft, let your shoulders drop, and imagine, if you will, the slow warmth of a Mediterranean afternoon somewhere in ancient Rome. The crowd is gathering. The vendors are selling olives of questionable freshness, and below the sand, in a holding cell that smells faintly of iron and regret, a man is considering a very bad career decision. Because tonight, we're talking about what happened to gladiators who refused to fight. Now, the Roman arena was not exactly a place known for gentle negotiation. It was loud. It was hot. It was filled with tens of thousands of spectators who had paid good money to watch someone else have a worse day than they were having. The amphitheatres, especially the grand one we now call the Colosseum, were architectural marvels, ingenious, efficient, designed with careful precision to move crowds in and out. Less carefully designed for the emotional well-being of the men about to step onto the sand. Gladiators were not, as movies sometimes suggest, all heroic volunteers seeking glory. Many were enslaved people, prisoners of war, criminals. Some were condemned men with very limited career options. A few did volunteer, because of course they did, lured by the possibility of fame, prize money, and perhaps the occasional romantic attention from a noblewoman who liked her men slightly blood-stained. But whether volunteer or captive, once you were in the system, you belonged to a lanista, the owner of a gladiator school, a businessman, a trainer, a man who looked at human beings and saw a return on investment. Gladiators were expensive to maintain. They were fed well, surprisingly. Barley, beans, high-carb diets meant to build a protective layer of fat over muscle. It turns out Romans understood that a slightly padded gladiator bled more dramatically, but survived longer. A practical detail, and in Rome, practicality always won. So imagine you are one of these men. You have trained for months, perhaps years. You've learned how to hold a gladius, how to angle your shield, how to fall convincingly. You've practiced dying without actually dying, which is a very Roman skill. And then, on the day of the games, your name is called. The gates creak open. The sunlight spills in. The roar of the crowd vibrates in your ribs, and you decide, no. It's a small word, quiet, but in an arena built on spectacle, it is thunderous. Refusing to fight was not common. Gladiators were drilled relentlessly. Discipline was strict. Punishments inside the schools were harsh enough that most men learned very quickly not to test boundaries. But occasionally, and history hints at this in scattered accounts, someone froze. Fear is not dramatic. It is not noble. It is simply human. Roman writers like Seneca the Younger occasionally commented on the psychology of the arena. He described the moral decay of the games, the way crowds demanded more blood, more cruelty. He wasn't writing specifically about refusals, but he gives us a glimpse into the pressure, the expectation, the sense that the arena consumed hesitation. If a gladiator refused outright, dropping his weapon, cowering, or attempting to flee, the immediate reaction would not have been sympathetic applause. The crowd could be merciless, booing, mocking, demanding punishment. And the editor of the games, the sponsor, often a politician seeking popularity, had a problem. Because the games were political theatre. They were statements of power and generosity. A refusal disrupted the script. Naturally, they made it worse. One likely outcome was immediate execution, not always by the scheduled opponent, but sometimes by attendants or guards. A refusal could be reframed as cowardice, and cowardice was contagious. Rome valued virtus, courage, manliness, discipline. A public failure had to be corrected publicly. In some cases, the refusing gladiator may have been whipped or beaten in the arena itself. The message was simple: the show continues. There are accounts suggesting that trainers stood ready with heated irons or lashes to drive reluctant fighters forward. Not subtle encouragement, more of a motivational strategy involving pain. Because here's the quiet truth: gladiators were property, and property does not get stage fright. Now, not every refusal ended in instant death. Context mattered. If the man was a valuable, highly trained fighter, a crowd favorite, the lanista might prefer punishment back at the school: a flogging, shackles, reduced rations. A reminder that defiance was economically inconvenient. But in front of a roaring crowd, mercy was less marketable. Let's drift for a moment into the psychology of the crowd itself. The Roman audience was not a single mind, but it could behave like one. Thousands of people, unified in expectation. They wanted courage. They wanted spectacle. A gladiator who fought bravely and lost could be admired, even loved. A gladiator who refused disrupted the emotional contract. And so, sometimes, the crowd demanded death not because the refusal was dangerous, but because it was disappointing. There's something strangely modern about that. Now, it's worth noting that not all arena combat was a chaotic free-for-all. Many bouts were carefully staged, matched opponents, referees present, rules enforced. Contrary to popular belief, not every fight ended in death. Gladiators were valuable. Killing them casually was bad business. But refusal undermined the illusion of control, and Rome prized control above almost everything. There is also the larger shadow hanging over all of this: rebellion. Because when we talk about gladiators refusing to fight, we can't help but think of Spartacus. Spartacus did not merely refuse to fight, he refused the entire system. In 73 BCE, he and a group of gladiators escaped their training school in Capua. They armed themselves, initially with kitchen utensils, which is both desperate and slightly poetic, and began what would become the Third Servile War.
For 2 years, Rome was deeply inconvenienced. Now, Spartacus's rebellion was not a simple arena refusal. It was organized, strategic, terrifying to the Roman elite. But it reveals something important. Gladiators were trained fighters. If enough of them decided not to cooperate, the consequences were severe. After the rebellion was crushed, brutally of course, Rome became even more cautious. Control tightened. Surveillance increased. The idea of defiance was not romantic to Roman authorities, it was contagious. And so an individual refusal, even a small one, could be treated harshly to prevent imitation. There's also another category worth mentioning: the damnati ad bestias. These were condemned criminals thrown to wild animals. They were not trained gladiators. They were spectacle victims. If one of them refused to participate, perhaps by collapsing or refusing to run, the outcome was grimly predictable. The animals were not interested in negotiation. For trained gladiators, however, the social dynamics were more complex. Some fighters developed reputations,
fan followings. Graffiti in Pompeii tells us that certain gladiators were adored, desired, celebrated. A popular fighter who hesitated might receive a different reaction than an unknown slave. But hesitation was risky. Roman honor culture was unforgiving. Masculinity was performance. Courage was public. To refuse was to shatter the illusion, and Rome did not enjoy shattered illusions. It's tempting to imagine a dramatic scene, a lone gladiator standing in the arena, lowering his sword, declaring that he will not kill for entertainment. A moral stand, a proto-pacifist. But the historical record suggests something less theatrical. Refusal was likely messy, emotional, fearful. A man shaking, a crowd jeering, guards intervening. And then, very quickly, a resolution designed to reassure everyone else that the system still worked. Because in Rome, systems mattered more than individuals. There were occasionally cases where a gladiator could appeal to the crowd, raise a finger, ask for missio, mercy. But that was after fighting, after demonstrating effort. Refusal before combat denied the audience their drama. It skipped the performance, and Rome loved performance. So what happened to gladiators who refused to fight? Usually punishment, often the immediate, sometimes fatal. Not because Rome was uniquely cruel, though it could be, but because the arena was a machine, a political tool, a public ritual, and rituals require compliance. The sand had to be stained eventually. The crowd had to leave satisfied. The sponsor had to gain popularity. And somewhere beneath it all, a lanista calculated losses. As we continue drifting through this world, we'll see that Rome had many ways of dealing with defiance. Some theatrical, some bureaucratic, some quietly efficient. But in the arena, under the Mediterranean sun, refusal was rarely the beginning of freedom. It was usually the end of the story. So settle in. Let the noise of the crowd fade, the torches dim, the gates close.
Hey everyone, let's drift softly from the roar of the Roman arena into something quieter, more perfumed, more silk-lined, more politically inconvenient. Tonight, we're stepping into candlelit corridors and drafty stone castles, into the private apartments of kings who made very public promises and then very private mistakes. Because kings, as it turns out, often got bored. And when they did, someone else usually paid for it. So settle in. Let the torches flicker low. Imagine the rustle of heavy brocade, the soft echo of footsteps in a palace hallway that smells faintly of beeswax and ambition. Royal mistresses occupied a strange space in history. They were powerful, but not legitimate. Admired, but resented. Protected, until they weren't. And when the king lost interest, well, let's just say the fairy tale rarely ended with a comfortable pension and a quiet countryside retirement. Let's begin in Tudor England, because of course we will. When we think of discarded royal women, it's almost impossible not to drift toward Henry VIII. A man whose romantic resume reads less like courtship and more like a public safety warning. Henry had mistresses throughout his reign, some quietly tolerated, some dangerously elevated. One of the most notable was Bessie Blunt, officially Elizabeth Blunt, who bore him a son in 1519. This was significant. Henry desperately wanted a male heir. His queen at the time, Catherine of Aragon, had not provided one who survived infancy. So when Bessie delivered a healthy boy, Henry Fitzroy, the king was pleased, very pleased. He acknowledged the child, gave him titles, raised him in wealth and privilege. And Bessie? She was married off. Not executed, not exiled, simply repositioned. This was often the most merciful outcome. A respectable marriage arranged by the king, a tidy exit, a polite erasure. Because royal mistresses could not linger indefinitely. Their presence complicated diplomacy. It irritated queens. It inspired gossip. And most importantly, it reminded everyone that the king's attention was portable. But not all endings were so smooth. Let's drift gently toward France, into the glittering halls of Palace of Versailles. Here, royal mistresses were not merely tolerated, they were practically institutionalized. Take Madame de Pompadour, mistress of Louis XV. She was not born into high nobility. She was clever, cultured, politically astute, and Louis adored her.
At first, Pompadour became more than a mistress. She influenced art, architecture, foreign policy. She supported Enlightenment thinkers. She essentially functioned as an unofficial advisor. And then, inevitably, the romantic spark faded. Now, here is where things become interesting. Louis XV did not discard her entirely. Instead, their relationship evolved. She remained at court, retained her apartments, maintained influence. Their intimacy shifted from romantic to strategic. This was rare. Pompadour survived boredom by making herself indispensable, which, if we're being honest, is a risky career strategy. Because not every mistress could transition into trusted confidant. Some were simply replaced. Louis XV, in fact, later established the Parc aux Cerfs, a discreet residence where young women were kept for the king's attention. It was less romantic liaison and more administrative system. And when those women were no longer interesting, they were quietly married off, given dowries, sent away, neatly handled, softly erased. But let's not be lulled into thinking it was always this bureaucratically tidy, because sometimes boredom met paranoia. And paranoia rarely ends gently. Drift back with me to Tudor England again. A young woman named Anne Boleyn caught Henry VIII's eye. She was not technically his mistress. She refused to be. Clever girl. Instead, she insisted on marriage, which meant Catherine of Aragon had to go. Henry broke with Rome, created the Church of England, reshaped English religion, all because he was bored. Anne became queen, and then, astonishingly quickly, Henry grew restless again. She failed to produce a surviving male heir. Court factions turned against her. Whispers began. And in 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed. Now, technically, she was a queen by then, but her rise began as a romantic obsession, and her fall followed the same pattern that doomed many mistresses. Usefulness expired. Execution was not the standard outcome for mistresses, but vulnerability was. Royal favour was oxygen. Without it, survival depended on alliances, family backing, wealth, timing. And queens, understandably, were rarely enthusiastic about sharing. Let's drift to Spain. In the rigidly Catholic court of Philip IV of Spain, royal mistresses existed despite official moral posturing. Philip had numerous affairs. His illegitimate children were acknowledged in varying degrees. One mistress, Maria Calderon, bore him a son who would later become Don Juan of Austria the Younger, a significant political and military figure. Maria herself. She eventually entered a convent. This was another common destination. Convents offered safety, respectability,
containment. A former mistress could retreat behind cloistered walls, removed from court intrigue. It was both protection and exile, because court life was dangerous terrain. A bored king might move on casually, but rival nobles, jealous courtiers, displaced favourites, they remembered. Mistresses were lightning rods for resentment. They symbolised access, influence without official rank. And when the king's attention shifted, so did the protection. Some were accused of corruption, of witchcraft, of manipulating policy. Whether true or not hardly mattered. Favour fades, accusations linger. Now, it would be unfair to paint every story in shades of doom. Some former mistresses retired comfortably, especially in France, where the role was semi-formalised. The title of maîtresse en titre even existed. There were apartments designated for the king's favourite. There was almost a job description. But even in these structured environments, the underlying truth remained. Position depended entirely on affection. And affection is famously unstable. Let's soften the lights even further. Imagine being a young woman at court, selected, perhaps flattered, by royal attention, elevated overnight, gowns, jewels, influence. Everyone watches you. Everyone measures how long you will last, because they all know the pattern. And when the king begins glancing elsewhere, the atmosphere shifts. Allies grow distant, invitations slow, smiles thin. It is a peculiar kind of countdown. Royal boredom was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was simply gradual. A missed visit, a cooler tone, a new face at supper. And suddenly, the world rearranges itself. For many mistresses, survival required reinvention. Some married strategically. Some leveraged their connections into political influence. Some wrote memoirs. Some vanished quietly into provincial estates. A few, the unlucky ones, became cautionary tales. And beneath it all is a strange irony. Kings, whose marriages were often diplomatic obligations, sought affection elsewhere. Yet the women who provided that affection were rarely granted security. They were both cherished and disposable, admired until they weren't. And as we let this story drift toward its next quiet corridor, it's worth noticing something almost tender in its sadness. Most of these women were navigating systems they did not create. They adapted, negotiated, survived when they could. And when kings grew bored, because kings often do, the consequences rippled outward, landing softly, or catastrophically, on the women nearest to them.